Hi there, and welcome back to JavaScript Fundamentals. Today we are going to talk about the standard event model, which is how we add and remove event handlers, as well as get information about an event whenever one takes place. And let's go ahead and get started. The code that I have on screen is what we had in the previous lesson. We use the DOM level 0 event handler on click to add a click event handler for every button element within the page. So the DOM level 0 event handler is a property on the DOM object itself. It starts with on, and then the event is whatever is after on. So this is going to execute on the click event for each of these button elements. But the problem with these DOM level 0 event handlers is that they can be overwritten very easily. All you have to do is assign a new value to the onClick event handler. And as I demonstrated in the previous lesson, this basically breaks our code because we are now executing a function that doesn't do anything whenever we click on those buttons. So this poses a problem because there are times whenever you want to execute multiple functions whenever a particular event occurs. And the standard event model was designed to take that into account. So let's look at how we can use the standard event model to give us this same functionality, but also give us the flexibility of being able to handle multiple pieces of code to execute when an event occurs. So let's first comment out this code using the DOM level 0 event handlers, just so that we can see the code that we used to use as opposed to what is considered correct today. And you're really not going to notice much similarities between DOM level 0 event handlers and the event handlers that we set up using the standard event model. We do have to specify the object that we want to place an event handler on, and then we do have to have a function to execute whenever that event occurs, but other than that, there's not going to be very many similarities. So we first specify the DOM object that we want to add an event handler to, and then we call a method called addEventListener. And this is going to accept at least 2 arguments, but we typically pass it 3. Because earlier browsers you had to specify the 3rd argument. The first argument is the event that we want to listen for. Now we aren't specifying on as we did with the DOM level 0 event handler because the actual event is the click event. So we are specifying click. And then the second argument is the function that we want to execute whenever this event occurs. So we can just copy and paste the function that we already have, but for right now I'm going to create a standalone function and I'm going to just call it button click. And then we will use the function name as our second argument. Now, we don't want to execute this function, we simply want to pass the function object. So we will just have the name of the function. And then as a third argument that determines if we use capture. And if we talk about capturing, we also have to talk about bubbling, because we can't talk about one without the other. So if you give me a few minutes, we'll talk about what those two things are. We'll also get a brief little history lesson. So way back in the 1990s, when the web was first taking off, there were primarily 2 browsers. There was Internet Explorer and there was Netscape Navigator. And the 2 browsers were almost completely different from one another. There were some similarities as far as their DOM was concerned, but other than that, they were almost totally completely different. If you wrote cross-browser JavaScript back then, you were considered a hero just because of how difficult it was. Well, Netscape Navigator incorporated the use of event capturing with its event model. So let's say that we click on our normal button. With event capturing, that click event actually originates at the document level. So it originates at HTML. And then it propagates down to each ancestor of the button element that we clicked until it gets to the button element. So we click on button, the event originates at HTML, it then goes down to the body element, and then it goes down to the button element that we clicked. And that is called the event target. And if our target was nested within more elements, then that click event would propagate down to those elements until it got to our target element, which is our button element. So if we had a click event handler set up at the HTML element, at the body element, then those event handlers would execute because the event is firing on each of those elements. So that's event capturing. Event bubbling is the exact opposite. It starts at the element that you click on, and then it propagates up until it goes to the document. And this is what Internet Explorer used. So whenever you would click on the button, it would start at that button, and that would be called the source element, but we could still call it the target. So it would start at the target, and then it would propagate up to the body, and then it would propagate up to the HTML element. So if we had an event handler set up for the body and for the document object, those event handlers would also execute after the button event handler executed. So whenever the W3C were coming up with the standard event model, they incorporated both models, both capturing and bubbling. So whenever you click on something or do anything as far as an event is concerned, that event goes through three phases. The first phase is the capture phase. The second phase is the event hitting the event target. And then the third phase is the bubbling phase. So whenever we call the add event listener method, we have to tell it if we want to use capturing or if we want to use bubbling. If we specify true, that means that we want to use capturing. But if we specify false, that means that we want to use bubbling. And if you are writing cross-browser JavaScript and targeting Internet Explorer 8, you have to specify false because Internet Explorer 8 and below do not support capturing. They only support bubbling. So if you want to target all of the major browsers, i.e. 8 is still a majorly used browser, then you will want to use event bubbling, so you will specify false. Now, as I said earlier, some browsers allow you to omit that third argument, but that's only a very recent change, so you will typically always want to specify the third argument. And that finishes up this event handler. So if we go back to the browser and refresh, whenever we click changed, it's going to give us the same results as we got before. So we can go back and forth just like we did before. And since we are using add event listener, we can set up another event handler to execute whenever the button is clicked. Let's pass in another function. And let's do something like alert hi. So whenever we click on either of these buttons, the class name is going to be changed for the body element, and we will also get the alert box that says hi. So I'll click changed. There we go. And then I'll click normal, same thing. So this is much better than it was before. It's a little bit more code that we have to write, but being able to set multiple event handlers for a single event is very nice. And let's say that you want to remove an event handler after you've created it, because sometimes you do want to do that. So let's remove the event handler that we specified on line 18. So to do that, we just use another method, buttons I, and then this is called remove event listener. And the trick here is that we have to provide the same information that we did whenever we called add event listener. So we have to specify the click event. We also have to specify the function that we used. And then we have to specify false for bubbling. So whenever we go back to the browser and refresh, we will not see any style changes made, but we will still see the alert box display. So there we go. I clicked changed. The background color and text color did not change, but we did get the alert box. Same thing whenever we click the normal button. And this is why I created the button click function, because we have to provide the same exact function object that we specified with add event listener that we do with remove event listener. So if we try to remove the event handler that we specified on line 19, we will not be able to do so. Why? Because we have used an anonymous function object here. So whenever we call or remove event listener. So remove event listener. If I will type it correctly, and we specify click, and we do function, if we type it exactly the same, it really doesn't matter because we have created a different function object for the remove event listener than we did for the function object whenever we called the add event listener. So whenever we go back to the browser and refresh, we will still see that alert box pop up. So if you ever want to remove an event listener after you have added it, you have to use that same function object that you used when calling add event listener. However, we typically don't remove an event handler after we've set one up. There will be times when we do want to do that, but 99% of the time we typically don't. So if you want to use an anonymous function when calling add event listener, feel free to. Just remember that if you want to remove that event listener, you actually need the same function object. So create that function either using function declaration syntax or using a function expression, and then pass that function object to the add event listener and the remove event listener. Okay, so whenever an event occurs, there is some information that we can retrieve because sometimes we need that information. And that information is passed to the function that we have specified when calling add event listener. It's passed as an argument, so we just have to specify a parameter. We can call this parameter anything we want. I typically use EVT. Sometimes I'll use event. Sometimes I'll use E. It really doesn't matter what you use, just use whatever you feel like, because that's what I do. So I'm going to use EVT, and one of the properties of this object is the type property. And this gives us the type of event that occurred. So whenever we call alert and pass in evt.type, we are going to get the value of click. And that information isn't very helpful, at least as far as our code is concerned, because this is only going to execute whenever the element is clicked. So type, as far as this code, is not very helpful. It will be helpful in a couple of days whenever we talk about event delegation, but that's in a couple of days. Just tuck that away. The second property we'll talk about is the target property. This is the element that received the event. So in this case, this would be the button element. So going back to the browser, refreshing, and we see HTML button element. Once again, though, this isn't very helpful for us in this particular demonstration because we can get that same information using the this variable. Going back, refreshing, clicking, and button element. But the target property is very helpful whenever we talk about, once again, event delegation. So tuck that away again. The last thing we'll talk about today is not a property, but it is a method, and it's called prevent default. And what this method does is prevents the default action of the event for whatever element that event is being fired on. So the best way to demonstrate this would be to use an A element instead of a button. So I'm going to replace button with A, and the href is set up to go to google.com. So naturally, whenever we click on these links, it's going to take us to google.com. I mean, nothing surprising there. That's exactly what we told it to do. But we do need to change the get elements by tag name method to get the A elements. And now whenever we set up these event handlers for these A elements, we are going to call this prevent default method, and that's going to prevent the browser from navigating to google.com whenever we click on the link. So refresh, whenever we click changed, it's just going to change the style of the body. Same thing if we click normal, it's not going to google.com, even though we can see google.com in the status bar. The prevent default method is preventing the default action of clicking an A element, which is to navigate to whatever is specified within the href attribute. And that will finish today's lesson. We talked about the standard event model, which is implemented in Chrome, Firefox, Safari, Opera, and Internet Explorer 9 and above. In the next lesson, we will talk about the legacy Internet Explorer event model, which is implemented in IE 8 and below. Actually, it's implemented in IE 9 as well. IE 9 supports both event models, but we always want to write standards-based code, so IE9 will use standards-based code. So have a good one. I will see you tomorrow.